Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the University of Bonn and the Center for Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the special focus day of the International Security Forum Bonn. The guiding theme for today's discussions is what to learn from the pandemic security in the light of COVID-19. I want to warmly welcome all participants, panelists, and speakers who share their time and insights with us. We are proud to have such a great lineup of experts from various disciplines. If there is one thing we have already learned about the pandemic management, it is that we need a multidisciplinary perspective from law to virology, from health studies to social sciences, and so forth, to find the most efficient and least harmful solutions to control the spread of the infectious disease COVID-19. Hence, I'm looking forward to listen to diverse perspectives during an extended interaction and conversation over the course of today. University of Bonn and the organizers of the International Security Forum Bonn want to acknowledge the kind support of many partners, including the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, America House North Rhine-Westphalia, Hans Seidel Foundation, the Institut Français, the German Council on Foreign Relations, the Chancellery of the Federal State North Rhine-Westphalia, the German Atlantic Association, and Friedrich Naumann Foundation, all of which make this event possible. Before we move on to the first keynote today, let's listen to two welcoming remarks via video statement. The first one is from Professor Dr. Volker Kronenberg, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts of the University of Bonn and the Director of the Center for Advanced Security and Strategic and Integration Studies. Dean Kronenberg, who cannot attend personally today, has supported the International Security Forum from day one and wants to extend his greetings to all of you.
Distinguished guests and participants, dear colleagues and audience of the International Security Forum. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you also on this day of the International Security Forum Bonn and to have the opportunity to address you with a few remarks. After listening to remarkably interesting presentations and discussions on the future of the transatlantic relationship yesterday, but today's focus will be particularly on the corona pandemic and its links and implications for international security. The corona pandemic hit the world almost unprepared in the midst of a turbulent period of upheaval. An aggressive trade conflict between the US and China, a difficult and unclear status in transatlantic relations, an EU struggling with Brexit and migration, years of wars in Syria and Yemen, and above all, the climate change, to name just a few of the challenges facing the states at the beginning of the year. At least since March, the corona pandemic is dominating all public debates and political plans. To this day, the COVID-19 crisis has us firmly in its grip. It will also shape the near future, exacerbating problems that required our attention even before the outbreak of the coronavirus. But history teaches us that the potential for change is particularly great in times of crisis. One thing is clear: the world after corona will look different than it does today. However, the corona crisis also shows us repeatedly how important multilateral cooperation is in today's world. When President Trump declared in May 2020 that the United States would leave the World Health Organization, there was a great deal of incomprehension and irritation. During one of the most devastating pandemics in history, which is already considered a warning example of the rapid spread of a disease in a networked and globalized world, the biggest supporter is leaving the responsible international organization. Despite all the criticism of the World Health Organization, it stands for the international community's claim to guarantee and improve global health for all people. The right to a standard of living that guarantees health and well-being is a fundamental human right, which is also reflected in the third Sustainable Development Goal, in which the international community agreed to ensure a healthy life for all people of all ages and to promote their well-being. And yet, health is not only a personal matter, but affects the entire society and its prerequisite for social and economic development, and thus ultimately for stability and peace. Health is consequently at the beginning of many of the challenges we face today. At the same time, health is a cross-cutting policy issue and depends on the interaction of various complex factors. I'm very glad, ladies and gentlemen, that my colleague, Professor Ilona Kickbusch, will be the opening speaker and will focus her speech on, it is called Health in All Policies approach. Ilona Kickbusch, a warm welcome. I'm glad that you join us today. In today's discussion, in various forms of debates, we will try to find answers to the questions such as, is the relationship between global health and security policy a neglected one? What are the different strategies with which countries respond to this challenge, which affects them all simultaneously in the form of a pandemic? What geopolitical consequences will the corona pandemic have? To what extent will it have a lasting impact on global power relations, multilateral cooperation, and international solidarity? On behalf of the Faculty of Arts, I would like to thank, as I did yesterday, not only the cooperating partners of this year's forum and, of course, the staff of CASES. It is thanks to their work and commitment that CASES has gained momentum and made it possible to organize such an interesting event with researchers and experts of the highest quality in panel discussions, as you will experience later in the day. Before that, I am pleased, extremely pleased, that the Federal Minister of Health, Jens Spahn, has taken the time to address a few words of welcome to us in the form of a video message, for which I would like to thank him sincerely. Distinguished guests, I wish you good, insightful discussions and an illuminating as well as entertaining conference day. Thank you very much.
Yeah, as Dean Kronenberg has said in his welcoming remark, we are delighted that the Federal Minister of Health, Jens Spahn, is going to share his thoughts with us. Minister Spahn, also he can't participate directly, expressed his greatest interest in our discussions at on the intersections of health and security.
Pandemic has brought many changes. Dear participants of the Special Focus Day Security Forum, in many areas of our lives, including healthcare, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought many changes and, last but not least, given a boost to digitization. The IT infrastructure is currently under particular strain. Moreover, cyber criminals are taking advantage of the crisis situation to make profit. It is obvious that a combination of coronavirus and computer virus is especially dangerous, as one alone can lead to death. This is why IT security is, besides distance and hygiene measures, particularly important in times of pandemics. Recent cybersecurity incidents, such as at the Düsseldorf University Hospital, demonstrate the risks of cyber attacks on healthcare structures. Suddenly, the abstract danger becomes reality. It shows that this is about nothing less than the maintenance of healthcare and thus the saving of human lives. A growing number of cyber criminals are seeking to capitalize on the vulnerabilities of the healthcare sector during this crisis. Hospital servers are encrypted by malware. Intellectual property, such as data relating to COVID-19 vaccine development, modeling, and experimental therapeutics, is stolen. In these times of worldwide crisis, firstly, we must invest in resilience. Secondly, create trust. And thirdly, strengthen the European Union and the international organizations in which we are involved. Therefore, the federal government also finances investments in the cybersecurity of hospitals. Hospitals are our backbone in fighting the pandemic, with a 4 billion funding program. 15% of the funds must be spent on IT security for each individual digitization project. Pure cybersecurity projects are also funded separately. For example, defense against attacks, next-generation firewalls, or detection of attacks, intrusion detection systems. Furthermore, the federal government provides a telematics infrastructure for secure communication in the healthcare system. One lesson that we have learned during the crisis is that the trust of the population is of central importance for the success of all measures, including those offered by the federal government. We have seen public trust is key. We have experienced transparency creates trust. Thus, it was an important concern of the federal government that the program code of the Corona Warn app, developed on behalf of the government, was made available as open source and thus became transparent and easier to understand for civil and developer society. Because transparency is the best remedy against uncertainty and mistrust, lastly, we Europeans must acknowledge the geopolitical importance of key digital technologies. We need both access to and control of the key security technologies. I wish you all a good exchange today and most of all, good health.
Yeah, thanks to Minister Spahn. As Minister Spahn has pointed out some of the central issues, including trust and also the use of digital tools, it is clear that the pandemic has made this year, the year 2020, in the most challenging year of the still fresh millennium. Yesterday, the daily number of new infections reached a new all-time high in the United States. Dr. Sanjay Gupta, the CNN chief medical correspondent, noted that the pandemic has become a humanitarian disaster in the United States. In Germany, on a single day during this week, almost 500 people died from COVID-19. Of course, the direct health impacts of COVID-19 are not the only problem. The lockdowns around the world, whether more or less strict, have imposed traumatic living conditions for millions of families. The economic, financial, psychological, and other secondary health effects on vulnerable groups are still too early to fully account for. Many children, for instance, might be losing perhaps a full precious year of education. COVID-19 has demonstrated that many countries, among them many of the richest societies, were not well prepared for a pandemic. A great deal of learning and improvements are thus necessary. It appears by now that the unexpectedly fast development of vaccines offers a silver lining. To become more hopeful is therefore not over-optimistic. Yet the pandemic is far from over. And in that sense, the unmitigated pandemic situation raises fundamental questions about human security globally and locally, and touches on various dimensions of non-traditional security. Theoretically and practically, it also poses the question how to build back better, how to make our public health system stronger, our societies in general more resilient, and mechanisms of international cooperation faster, more coordinated, and more inclusive. Hence, we are talking about what to learn from this pandemic. We will automatically explore the vital aspects of human security and at the most basic and existential level. And with that, I want to give the floor to Daniela Braun from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, who will introduce our first keynote speaker.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the keynote speech of Professor Ilona Kickbusch on what to learn from the pandemic, security in light of COVID-19. The pandemic has drastically emphasized that epidemics and pandemics are hardly a thing of the past. In fact, it's quite the contrary, as the risk of a rapid spread of infectious diseases is greater than ever before in a highly connected 21st century. Next to the enormous ramifications of the pandemic on public health, socioeconomic development, social behavior, COVID-19 has also impacted international politics, security affairs, and geopolitics. But COVID-19 is not the first health crisis that has been brought into close context of security and stability, and I think, or I guess it also won't be the last. The HIV/AIDS pandemic, or SARS in 2002 and 2003, or the West African Ebola outbreak, they all have shown that large-scale health events have the ability to impact security, stability, and international affairs by affecting military forces and operational readiness, socioeconomic development, stability, patterns of conflict, political violence, and geopolitics. So let me first thank the organizers for choosing this very timely and vital topic for this year's Special Focus Day. But above all, I want to thank Professor Ilona Kickbusch for accepting the invitation to give this year's keynote speech. I believe there could be no better experts to kick us off today for this timely issue than Professor Ilona Kickbusch. She has a long and distinguished career in global health, and she's the founder and chair of the Global Health Center at the Geneva Graduate Institute. She advises senior government officials and the WHO on global health strategies, among many other positions, which I won't name all because we haven't time for that. But Professor Kickbusch is a member of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board and the WHO's High-Level Independent Commission on NCDCs. It was just announced that Professor Kickbusch will be also part of the Robert Koch Institute Scientific Board on advising the Institute on International Health Protection. I'm very curious to hear your remarks, and I hand it over to you. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who might be listening and joining us today. I've been asked to give the keynote introduction, and as we heard earlier, it's so important to have a multidisciplinary approach to what we are discussing. And my perspective on what to learn from the pandemic is one that comes from political science and international relations. I have prepared some PowerPoints to just highlight some of the issues that I will be talking about, and I hope we're going to see them in a minute. There they are. So what can we learn? I think, the very first thing we have to learn is that we have to think beyond the present crises. That is absolutely critical. We are seeing in so many areas, and if we could have the next slide, please, that we must really understand that while we are caught in the present crisis response, we actually need to prepare our multilateral systems, but also our democracies, much better for such incidences as global pandemics. We've got to have a clearer understanding which type of crises are actually coming our way, how we can be equitable in our approach to protection, and what kind of mechanisms we need to establish. I'm going to mention one or two of them. One is related to what the minister already indicated. How can we really establish reliable global level surveillance and analyses of risks? And these risks are multi-hazard. I will come back to that. What really are anticipatory triggers? We have seen that the declaration of a public health emergency of international concern was not seen as a serious trigger for action by many countries, particularly Western countries. We have to have new mechanisms of governance and alignment of response. And here too, we have failed quite considerably. And we need to approach the governance and in particular, the financing of collective preparedness in a new way. Some of you might be familiar with the work on the Global Risk Society by Ulrich Beck. Within that work, he speaks about the possibility of a cosmopolitan moment, which is basically, the moment that maybe the global health community, the global security community, the political community will wake up and actually work together. I think, as you can see, obviously we need change, we need transformation. I don't actually like the term build back better. I think we really need to build forward. We need to be much more courageous and determined in what we want to build. And in the global health community and partly in the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, we are discussing three big resets. One is that our mindset needs to change, and I will give some examples of that our governance needs to change. And one of the key governance mechanisms that we have started to discuss, initially suggested by the GPMB, but taken up by the European Union, is to shape a new global pandemic treaty. And discussions are already underway with the World Health Organization how to move that forward. And then, of course, as always, we have a major resource question to ensure the financing of global public goods. So if we first look at the mindset, and I think with that mindset, we can use to a large extent also the thinking that was done by Ulrich Beck already a decade ago on the Global Risk Society, when, if we could have the next slide, please, when we were thinking mainly of the environmental threats that were coming our way. People still thought a pandemic threat might be far in the future and something that we might be able to avoid. We can see from that change of mindset that, and some of the introductions have alluded to that we really need a new understanding of security. And as you can see on the next slide, I think we should take as a basis for that new thinking around security the work done by Kate Raworth. She has spoken of, the donut economy, which sounds very nice and scrumptious, but it's really a big challenge to say, how do we understand security as we have to navigate a rather changed landscape that works on the interface of human and planetary health, and should actually lead us to a new understanding of planetary health and well-being. And it's this very, very integrated thinking around security and risk that we need to address. As you can see on the next slide also, even visually, that is something we can approach. We speak now of the Anthropocene, where it is actually humans that define what our world looks like. And you can see here two pictures of things that look very, very similar. One, obviously, is the coronavirus. How could it not be? But the other is actually a visual presentation of the urbanization of the world. And we know, as we look at zoonosis and other challenges, how intricately these two types of developments, these two security challenges are related. And I would recommend to all of you to actually look at the new special report that the Munich Security Conference issued, where they speak about a polypandemic. That is, that the crises, the risk, on the one hand, is emerging simultaneously in many different areas of our lives and economies, but that at the same time, they are highly dynamic and interactive. And that our siloed approach to here's a pandemic, here's the environment, here's the economy, and actually also partly juxtaposing them is something that we cannot really afford. We also, in the view of much of the nationalism we have experienced over the last year, we really have to find a way in our mindset to accept that all these risks are global and that clearly no one is safe until everyone is safe. But I think there are other key failures that I think you skipped a slide. No? Okay. Yes, this one. There are other key failures that we really have to address. And I think this is particularly in relation to the Western democracies. I already mentioned that many countries did not respond to the warning of the World Health Organization at the end of January that there is a public health emergency of international concern. Around pandemics, there was clearly the feeling these are somewhere else. This is about them, not us. In the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, we have shown how we always seem to prepare for the last crises. We don't think forward to the next crises. We actually warned that we might have an influenza-type crisis, but the world was prepared for another Ebola, for something that was happening in the developing world, something that was not happening to us. So this lack of preparedness is also a mind frame that we have to deal with. And I think it's partly also related, if we think of mind frames, who we are willing to learn from. And for me, it has been one of the most worrying dimensions, how little the Western democracies were willing to learn from the Asian countries, and particularly from the Asian democracies. So a big change of mindset. That mindset obviously has to reflect itself in the approaches to governance that we need to think about. And again, you see this picture reflects that interface of the many different crises we have to think about. And I'd like to issue a warning, as you can see on the next slide, that we frequently say the virus does not discriminate. From a political perspective, that's obviously not true, because the virus does feed off, or any virus, not just the coronavirus, of the political, economical, and social flaws in our society. Maximilian Mayer referred to some of those. And so the virus experience takes on the features of those respective societies. So the virus will always exploit system weaknesses in every way, at the local level, at the national, and at the global level. And that is why we have started to speak about how do we make our societies, what the term we have used is, how do we make them more pandemic proof? And we have seen the two key failures that have really led to some of these very high infection and death rates have been nationalist approaches. We already alluded to the very difficult situation with the United States. And we have an expression of, at the one hand, not being willing to act nationally, and on the other hand, not being willing to act at the multilateral level. But, and I think that is really the critical thing, these are not things that happened overnight. These are weaknesses in, and I'm focusing now on democracies, in our democracies, and these are weaknesses in the global system that we have not been willing to address for at least a decade, if not longer. We've done some work, as you can see in a special issue of the British Medical Journal, on democracies and health. And from that, we have, on the one hand, seen, initially one thought, oh, democracies are going to deal much better with this than autocracies. We all said, look at the Chinese lockdown, never will we do something like that. There was a lot of discussion around that, but we can see that democracies responded very differently, and that those democracies that were defined by more populist and divisive policies did not deal as well with the virus. And we saw very clearly that democracies that do not have a high level of social security are also not really able to deal with their health security. So we will need a much better understanding in our democracies, not only at the legal level, how we can become more pandemic proof, but also in relation to issues of trust of citizens in their government. And of course, one thing we have seen and we must learn is that many of the regulations that we had around emergencies in our democracies were for short-term crises and not for a pandemic that can take up 1 to 2 years. And we saw that democratic processes, parliaments couldn't meet, elections couldn't be held. Many of these things became very destructive and actually contributed to having less trust. But one of the most dangerous issues that we have encountered is, as you can see on the next slide, the purposeful disinformation and digital hate. And here we are really having to live with the consequences that we have not been able or willing to regulate hate speech, that we have not been willing or able to regulate disinformation. And next to the issues that the minister mentioned, this is going to be one of the big challenges. And as you know, the European Union is starting to take this up. Unless we can counteract purposeful disinformation, that, as we can see, is not just related to health, it is using health for political purposes of destabilizing Western democracy. Unless we address that, we are not going to be able to deal with one of the most critical things around pandemics. We have highlighted from the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, and the next slide shows this, that we need to have a much clearer focus also on communities, on how communities contribute to a pandemic, but also how communities respond, the kind of information they need. We have spoken about health literacy, we've spoken about digital literacy, but what we have neglected significantly is what we are calling civic literacy. And that is, you know, the way we share information, the way we deal with one another, the way we take a democratic participatory approach, also to a pandemic forward. And we can see a number of those examples also in the Asian democracies. If you look at developments that are called civic tech, I would urge you also to listen to some of the speeches of the digital minister of Taiwan. You can see approaches to involvement related to health and digital literacy that we can really build on, because unless we have a population that is willing to cooperate over a long period of time, and that's what we're facing, think of all the Christmas discussions we're having right now, unless we do that, we are not going to be able to move forward. So it's very important that we link our security and our health discussions to a discussion about democracy and about democratic processes. The next slide indicates, the importance of that political focus, and it's a focus both in terms of our institutions, the discussions in many parliaments, to what extent they must be involved in decisions around pandemic response. And it is about involving the community in new ways that we can really address these flaws at community level, at national level, but also in terms of the multilateral level. And because of this multilateral level, I come back to this key issue that people have put forward in terms of a cosmopolitan moment. It is, as you can see on the next slide, as I want to remind you, the proposal for an international pandemic treaty to coordinate a global response to future outbreaks. And the idea is to take here the model of two existing international frameworks we have, the Paris Agreement on climate change and the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And these are framework agreements. These are agreements that are intersectoral, that need multidisciplinary input, that need to be negotiated not at the level of health ministers or foreign ministers, that need to be negotiated at the level of heads of government and heads of state. And it is this kind of treaty that will need to be taken forward. We have the international health regulations, this, but they are about a technical preparation for preparedness. They have a number of weaknesses that are being addressed right now in a committee that is actually headed by Lothar Wieler, the head of the German Robert Koch Institute. But beyond that, we will need much larger issues that need to be dealt with, that range from trade to supply chains to security issues, the role of the military, all these issues that need to be addressed in a much larger treaty. And as I indicated, the EU is already talking with the WHO. The Global Preparedness Monitoring Board is talking with the Secretary General of the United Nations. This is an issue we need to take forward. My last point is that we need to address financing. And for this reason, for example, the WHO just announced that it is establishing a WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All. That council is being chaired by Mariana Mazzucati, one of the leading forward-thinking economists on global public goods and public value. And in this context, we need to discuss how the United Nations and particularly World Health can develop a reliable mechanism. I have outlined that on the next slide, a reliable mechanism at a global level to raise revenues for global functions produced by the United Nations system. We have to some extent such a mechanism. They are called the assessed contributions of the member states, but it is quite clear that these are insufficient, that many of them have stalled, particularly since the 1980s. WHO's budget has not been allowed to increase since the 1980s, an initiative of the Reagan administration at the time. Germany is trying to change this. There is a strong push for stronger assessed contributions, but even this money will not be enough. We are experiencing this, and this is on everyone's mind now, as the next slide shows, what and is going to happen with the vaccines that it seems we now have. And in my view, and also Mariana Mazzucatti says this, that the distribution of coronavirus vaccines will be the defining global challenge of 2021 and will be our global solidarity test case. Because we have no financing mechanism, the tragedy of this is that we have to rely on fundraising rather than have a reliable mechanism to actually address this. It's very interesting if you also see the comparison, as you'll see on the next slide, between the Paris Agreement, I've mentioned that as one of the models of a global treaty, and the approach to COVAX. COVAX is a global facility that WHO, together with other partners, particularly the Global Vaccine Alliance, has built up over the last 6-7 months or so. We do have over 180 countries joining into that initiative, but the financing and distribution is still a major challenge, and the G20 was not able to come up with a financing mechanism that actually allows for that more equitable distribution. The interesting thing that you can see on these two slides is who joined Paris and who joined COVAX, that the big gaps are, in this case, the United States. We're going to see a new map with the Biden administration, who has said they will rejoin Paris, and it will be absolutely essential that we see the United States joining the COVAX initiative and agreeing to pool resources in a new way while we are trying to develop a new mechanism. We have to transform global health funding. Otherwise, we will not get global security. And so this WHO Council, as other initiatives, will be looking at new financing frameworks that allow a sustained source of revenue for the global health security. And it's absolutely clear that our way of approaching this through overseas development aid, through replenishment, through fundraising, through philanthropies, through working with Hollywood stars and rock musicians, as much fun as that is, it is not a way to finance our global security. And it will be one of the challenges of such a global treaty to also face up to the need to finance this. I think it's actually quite tragic that the G20 that responded with new financing mechanisms and rules after the financial crises has still not been able to take the health crisis seriously enough to actually establish a financing mechanism. We know this is partly true because the United States has not been very cooperative. So there is great hopes that the G20 with Italy in the presidency and working together with the European Union, there is a meeting planned in May on this issue, will be able to take this financing mechanism idea forward. Let me just quickly highlight two more points that we need to consider in terms of governance. One issue is, if we think of the governance of health security, we must not only look at the health organizations. It is absolutely essential, for example, that we look at the World Trade Organization. And you know, there are the TRIPS agreement, there is the Doha Declaration, there are the many issues that actually relate to the waivers of TRIPS obligations if we want to share global vaccines and if we want to share therapeutics or diagnostics. South Africa and India have taken an initiative for such a temporary waiver. The leading candidate for the directorship of the World Trade Organization has indicated that she would support such a move. Of course, also this appointment has been moved because the United States has backed another candidate and is not going to move forward. But we will see that as we formulate such a treaty for pandemic preparedness, the role of the World Trade Organization, the role of the major development banks, both the Asian and the others, the role of the Bretton Woods institutions will be absolutely critical to integrate in such a treaty. And finally, what will be critical to integrate in such a treaty, as the next slide shows, is exactly the issue that Minister Spahn alluded to. We cannot have health security without cybersecurity. Those vulnerabilities are increasing significantly. So we need to be able to manage, on the one hand, the protection and the security of all the information and digital systems we are developing. But at the same time, we need a global open source pandemic alert system. And this cybersecurity open source alert system will need to be a critical element of the kind of treaty that would need to be negotiated. And of course, that would also include all the issues around false information and what WHO calls the infodemic. So I will end with my last slide. What we need is obviously preparedness, but we can only have preparedness if we have collective action between different sectors of politics, collective action between countries to work together, at first instance regionally, like in the EU, like in the African Union. The African countries have found a very, very strong way to work together to address this pandemic. Also, the African Union working very, very closely with the WHO. We have found that if we want to be safe, we must protect and strengthen multilateralism. That is why political initiatives like the Alliance for Multilateralism are just as critical as the support of WHO. That is also a priority of German foreign policy. We have to realize that the virus is a challenge and is a test to our democratic way of life. And I would hope that parliaments, that non-governmental organizations, that political scientists really focus on this interface of democracy and the pandemic. We need to understand that we need to protect each other, and that is a mind frame change at the community level. It's not only about saving myself, it's about protecting you. And we can see that unless we get that mind frame that we can only protect ourselves, if we are willing to protect others, we will fail. We will fail in the environment, we will fail on pandemics, we will fail on wealth distribution, and we will not be able to secure the future of ourselves, of our planet, and we will most definitely not reach the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ilona Kickbusch, for your very forward-looking remarks. You highlighted for us the importance of the multilateral system, that we have to prepare better, that we have to prepare our democracies. You talked about to make them more pandemic-proof. That we also have to change our mindset. We tried working on this today, how we can get to a better understanding of security, a more integrated approach of security. You highlighted the Treaty for Pandemic Preparedness, which we will see probably a lot of discussion about in the next months, how we can fill this with life and take this forward. And also the important issue of financing, of sustainable financing, global health, also in terms of vaccination. So many of the points you alluded for us are very, very important, and we will discuss them further today. And I received also first questions from the audience, and we have 10 minutes left. So I would suggest, if that's okay for you, Professor Kickbusch, I would pose 2 questions each of the time to you, if that's okay, but I can repeat them in case you need to hear them again. So my first question is about the role of the EU in global health. So in the beginning of the pandemic, Europe's reaction to COVID was far from united and coordinated. The European nations acted initially quite chaotic and shutting their borders, hoarding essential equipment. So in some, not a response which was marked by solidarity. To be fair, the European Commission, the competencies of the European Commission on health are rather limited, but this doesn't excuse why member states did initially not support each other. In November this year, the European Commission put forward first proposals to build a stronger health union. Can you probably elaborate a little bit on these proposals and how you assess them? And then the second question. There are only a few weeks to Christmas, Professor Kickbusch. What would be your personal wish list to improve health resilience in Western democracies and other countries worldwide? Thank you.
As a Christmas wish. Well, I'll start with the first thing. You're quite right that initially the member states of the European Union did not give a good picture of solidarity. But they did wake up quite quickly, and I actually think it made a difference that the president of the European Union is a doctor and a public health specialist. I think she probably also personally realized more rapidly than many others also in the Commission itself that this was serious business and that one had to react jointly. I think, many of us, and I belong to them, have been pushing for, years, if not decades, for stronger health competencies of the European Union. There is a question whether one can reach those under the present treaty, or whether it actually needs a treaty change. And it's one of the issues that might need to come up in the upcoming conference for Europe and in other bodies to take that forward. It's very important, though, that this element of a European health union is not only focused on pandemic preparedness and response, as important as that might be, but also includes other issues. There is, of course, the issue of European institutions, a much stronger ECDC, European Centre for Disease Control, which means also that the member states need to interact much more proactively with such a centre, the international global role of such an ECDC, the discussion around a preparedness agency maybe, the importance of the European Medical Agency. We see that right now in terms of the approval of new vaccines. How quickly can such an agency react, for example, in an emergency situation? And then the discussion, even though one isn't supposed to use the word anymore, of a more science-based organization, a European BARDA. So there is a lot of institutional change that would be possible even without a treaty change. The important thing is that the European Health Union that everyone speaks about now, we actually issued a manifesto on it, isn't only inward looking. You know, it's really important the European countries work together, no question. But a European Health Union has to have a very strong global health responsibility. It's played some of that in the last months. It actually filled up some of the void that the US left in being very proactive within the WHO, in helping raise funds for the COVAX facility, in indicating it would share vaccines that it would not need itself, etc., etc. But there will need to be more of that. There is a working group of the trio presidency that also takes that forward. And there have been suggestions that there be very strong council conclusions on global health in a European Health Union, but also a defined European global health strategy. And it's an issue Germany started a discussion on. It will have to continue with the Portuguese and the following up presidencies to actually really position the European Union as a key global player. And of course, you know, I didn't have time in my presentation to talk about all the geopolitical stuff that's going on. And this is a policy arena where the European Union, also because of its role in the G20, etc., can make a significant difference if it has a strategy, if it knows what it wants, and if it's willing to face up to some of the other global powers who might not be that willing to go in that direction. So it's not only going to be nice, it will also, you know, imply some conflict. Christmas, we all want Christmas. There are German politicians who have said, you know, this will be the worst Christmas since we can think. I'm not quite sure, you know, I'm a bit older maybe than many of the people listening in. I seem to remember quite nice Christmases that I had as a kid. It's an issue of what I highlighted around solidarity. And it's an issue that also raises questions about, you know, Ulrich Beck said, the really key question for the future is how do we want to live? And therefore, you know, it's not just building back better. It's really looking forward and saying, you know, how do we want to live our lives? And why isn't it possible, to take a decision to be more solidaric at a certain point in time? And we see that, you know, we see that Australia, we see that New Zealand, I've mentioned the Asian countries, have been able to have an immense common effort. If you look at the lockdown in Melbourne and Victoria, how it was defined as a community effort. We are all in this together. And it was absolutely extraordinary. Also, if you follow the Twitter feeds around that, etc., this was defined as a common effort of us all. And if we manage this now, we are going to have the freedom later. And it seems in some of our democracies here, we want everything now, all of the time. And that is not possible. And we have to learn from this, because this is not going to be the last pandemic. We are going to see more of these kinds of things that are happening. And unless we're able really to deal with and learn from this pandemic, learn those general issues, the trust issues, the democracy issues, the collective financing issues, we are going to fail the next time around. And just think of it, if the next time around is a virus that is easily transmittable, that is a flu-type virus, then we're sunk unless we do things right now.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are running out of time already, But yes, again, let me thank you for this very relevant and absorbing keynote speech. As I said before, I think there could be no better expert here with us this morning to give us food for thought for this day ahead. We are going to discuss further questions of security implications of health topics. In particular, of course, we are looking at COVID today for in 3 other panels which are following. Thank you also to the audience for listening to us this morning, and please stay safe and healthy, and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.